Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another individual album review. Today I'm reviewing the newest album from Hamish Hawk, A Firmer Hand. So I first heard of Hamish Hawk last year when he put out his album Angel Numbers. Now I am planning on listening to that album, but I haven't yet. I've been busy with a lot of other reviews, and with year-end list season coming up, I really feel like I gotta start working on that pretty soon. And by the way, on that topic, I will, at the end of this video, give a little bit of an update on what I'm planning to do with year-end lists, because it's gonna look a little different from previous years, especially being on a YouTube channel now instead of a blog, although I am making some other changes as well. But anyway, enough of that. I still haven't listened to Hamish Hawk's 2023 album Angel Numbers. This is the only Hamish Hawk album I've listened to so far. I've listened to it probably about a dozen times in preparation for this review, maybe more, honestly. And yeah, I'll explain why very soon. But yeah, I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this album. I heard some really good things about Angel Numbers, and yeah, I was kind of considering listening to that one first and his first album too, but I just decided to go into this without having heard any of his previous albums. I had no idea what to expect, and yeah, I was curious to hear this. I was hearing some good things about this, and I saw one review in particular which was really positive on it, so it brought up my expectations. And yeah, it's a really good thing I listened to this because this is some of the best post punk that I have heard this year. And it's not even just post punk, it blends a lot of genres. There's post punk, there's sort of, stereotypical indie rock sound. And there's a lot of experimentation and subtle details within so many of these tracks. They're so layered. There's so much about this album that really just like kept me really interested in it all the way through. It's 12 tracks. It's only under 40 minutes, so it doesn't take a while to get through. It's not too much to take in all at once. It is in some ways, but if you want to analyze it really deeply, I think it works in that sense, but also if you just want to listen to it more casually in the background, it's got some really awesome catchy tracks on it. And yeah, I'm not going to have a ton to say. This review is a little bit rushed. I've been trying to get this review out sooner rather than later, but I do have some more specific comments I want to make on some of the individual tracks. And yeah, like I'll admit, I haven't heard a ton of post punk this year that's really wowed me, and I'm a big fan of the genre. And yeah, I'm really glad I decided to hear this because yeah, this is some of the best post punk that I've heard this year, in the past few years, honestly. And again, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but I do want to briefly go over each track, and then I'm going to give sort of, an my overall thoughts on the album as a whole afterward. Okay, one more thing I forgot to mention that I want to say before I go over these tracks is look, this album is really hard to understand lyrically, at least for me, because I'm not the smartest person out there, at least when it comes to analyzing lyrics. And I often am one to just go on and on and on about stuff which I'm sure is not accurate when I'm describing lyrics. I'll start, focusing on a few specific lines and go, oh, maybe that means this, and maybe that means this, when really I'm pretty sure I'm overthinking it. So just keep that in mind. I'm not claiming that I know what these songs are about, and while there are a few spots where I mention things that Hamish has actually said about these songs, outside of that, a lot of this is just my own personal interpretations, kind of trying to see if I can figure out something that's going on. But yeah, don't take everything that I say about the lyrics to be like, oh wow, Simon said this, so I think there's gotta be something to it. Like, I could be completely wrong. So, like a lot of the songs on this album, the opening track, Juliet, as Epithet, is very tricky to untangle. But I do think it feels like pretty much the perfect intro for this album, really giving the listener an idea for the sort of album that this is going to be. Like, just the eeriness of this track really gives the signal that this is going to be kind of a bleak, spooky album, and in a lot of ways it is. And while it's not really the style of the majority of the tracks here, I think this track, it is quite different from a lot of the other songs on this album. It's still very effective. It seems to show the narrator getting pulled into a toxic relationship, but only because he can't find anybody else. At least that's the vibe I get from a line like, he holds my hand through the sad advances. Why wouldn't he, though? And yet there's a feeling of glamour that is hinted here with the somewhat cheery warbled guitar and bright vocal melodies. But again, it feels like this is more of an intro track than anything, sort of setting up the rest of the album and really preparing you for what is going to be a really heavy listen throughout the entire album. And yet, the opening track will not even come close to preparing you for the second track, Machiavelli's Room. Look, I typically feel more prepared to go on and on and on, waffling about a bunch of interpretations of songs, like I was saying earlier, where I go on and on and on, pretending that I have figured it all out, when really I haven't, because I can acknowledge to you that, yes, you should take my interpretations with a grain of salt. I did that at the start of this video. And yet, with a song like this, even with that acknowledgement, I don't feel fully prepared to talk about this song. Because I feel like anything that I try to say about it, I feel like I won't do it justice. Seriously, this is an absolute behemoth of a song, which I've been trying to figure out and untangle, and I'm not even sure where to begin. There are so many subtle details that make this so much more fascinating, and I feel like it reveals more about itself on each listen. And it feels like it goes beyond being just fascinating art. To me, it's more of an earth-shattering beast, which, again, I don't even know how to talk about. Seriously, this track has been on repeat for me non-stop, and even when I'm not listening to it, it's been stuck in my head non-stop, with that piano melody of only 2 notes, somehow being catchier than the average TV theme or commercial jingle. And look, like I've said, it's really hard to know what this song is about. But my best guess is that at its core, this song is about hedonism. And it seems to be asking the listener a lot of questions, at least subtly, but not being completely against the idea of hedonism in general, especially when hedonism is, at the end of the day, a pretty open-ended term. But before I get too carried away, I do really like the funky groove of Big Cat Tattoos, a song which also has a bunch of extra sound effects that really add to a more memorable sound. And there are also some really great lines in that track, such as, "You bored my friends from out of town with the virtues of shoegaze." Nancy Dearest, however, has a much more of a post-punk vibe to it, with that steady drum beat and the awesome synths that feel very 80s-esque, and those killer guitars which make this feel like a classic rock song despite having been released just this year. And I think it's worth mentioning that I saw Hamish said in an interview that this album became a place where he could offload the, to put it in his words, ugly arsenal of great unsaids that he'd been building up over the past few years. And it's very noticeable in certain songs, such as the aforementioned Machiavelli's Room and Big Cat Tattoos. And on Nancy Dearest, he seems to be talking about that idea as a whole, and the shamelessness that he conveys in this post-punk rocker is really extravagant. And it's the kind of post-punk that I've been waiting to hear all year, and I haven't even mentioned that hook is really great. Dearest Nancy dances past me. Anyway, I'm sorry for my god-awful singing. Autobiography of Spy is the next track, and I really like the musical contrast between this track and the previous few. And I think that's one thing that this album as a whole does a really great job of, where each track has something new to offer. And I think the drums and strings sound really good on this song too, and there definitely isn't a lack of strong melodic moments. And then there's You Can Film Me, which has the sort of post-punk vibes that you'll find in a song like Nancy Dearest, but it's a lot more low-key and funky, and yet it's still great all the same. And yeah, I don't find this track as lyrically dense or creative as the majority of these tracks, but it's mostly due to the competition it has by being on such a phenomenal album. And I also really like the next track, Christopher Street, which tells the story of gay liberation activist Marsha P. Johnson, while using very few words, and it almost says more in the track's solemnly beautiful piano and vocals than in the lyrics themselves. It's a really powerful moment, which is unlike any other track here, and yeah, it might be top half in the album. And then there's the absolutely epic Men Like Wire, which goes back to full-on post-punk with some of the best drum production on the album and a more absolutely blazing guitar, which just tears down everything in its path. Now, unfortunately, the following questionable hit does sound a little bit more like a generic post-punk track that doesn't really have a whole lot to offer in the grander scheme of things, at least to me. Don't get me wrong, this track is good, but it's probably my least favorite song here and the closest thing this album has to a skip. But the final 3 tracks are fantastic. First, there's Disingenuous, which has a really fun drum groove and the sort of post-punk guitars which are totally up my alley. Hamish has described this song as being about writing songs, or rather not writing songs. And like a lot of this album, the cryptic lyrics really stand out, where the cynicism feels mostly justified due to the bleakly eerie sonic qualities of the track. But it does feel a little over the top as well, and intentionally so. And then Milk and Ending has absolutely incredible production, where this chaotic, hefty collection of sounds managed to all blend together to create an enamoring soundscape that you don't typically hear in this kind of post-punk, at least not done this well. And thematically, I like how it sets up the closing track, the hard one, being mostly at peace and content while still feeling like something's been a little off the entire time, with arguably one of my favorite lines in the album being, "And it's not easy to say, but I've won the hardest way." And I also really like that synth ostinato that keeps this track engaging from front to back without taking away your attention from every small detail in the production that makes this song such an excellent hazy closing track that might leave more questions than answers. And it's a great way to end the album on a more mellow note, but still powerful all the same. And just going back to the track Milk and Ending, which I was just talking about, it can kind of feel like a bit of a sequel to Machiavelli's Room, seeming to show a bleak night of pleasure and guilt, which may have the potential to be two sides of the same coin, especially considering how much sexual desire there is on some of these songs, and the psychological morals, for lack of a better word, feel like too much for me to try and figure out all in this review. And yeah, this goes back to the whole thing about hedonism that I mentioned earlier, and really I think the best thing I can say at this point to avoid going on a long tangent before ending this review is that I highly recommend you listen to this album for yourself. I know you were expecting me to say that anyway, but I think a lot of what I'm saying will make a lot more sense once you've heard the record for yourself. Yeah, I know a lot of what I'm saying is, again, like I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure how accurate it all is, but another thing that I really like about this album as a whole is, or, the individual tracks and the album as a whole, is I feel like each time I listen to it, it's like you can interpret it in a different way each time, and that really shows, I think, to me, how great a writer Hamish Hawk is, at least on this album. I haven't heard his other albums, but it really shows there's a lot of layers to this, and I would love to go on and on and on and talk more about it, but for two reasons I'm not going to. One, time, it's going to take a while for me to try to really analyze it all. And also, again, I think albums like these are ones where you kind of have to just say, I think you should listen to it for yourself. I think you'll get a lot more out of it that way than hearing me talk about it. And again, sonically, it's so strong. There are so many great tracks, so many great hooks. Some of these songs have been stuck in my head a lot. Even the weaker tracks, I didn't love Questionable Hit, but even that, it's not a bad track. There's nowhere near a bad track on this album. And again, yeah, it's got a great variety of styles. There's the more mellow tracks, like the closing track and Christopher Street. And then there's the full-on post-punk bangers like Nancy Dearest and Men Like Wire. And again, Machiavelli's Room is something else. That track, you can't be prepared for a song like that. But yeah, overall, I absolutely loved this record. It's easily not only among the best post-punk I've heard this year, not only among the best post-punk I've heard probably this decade. This has got to be among the best albums that I've heard this year, without question. In the top tier of albums I've heard this year, without question. If you are familiar with my rating system, which is, again, it's a bit of a weird rating system. I've mentioned that before. But if you're familiar with my rating system, a 9.5 out of 10 is my way of saying it's in the top tier of albums I've heard this year. And that's the rating I'm going to go with for this album. Again, absolutely incredible record. It's hard to fully describe with words. Again, it's one I think you have to hear for yourself. I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, so I'll shut up. Great record, though. I highly recommend it. I'm really curious to hear his other albums. Alright, so just before I end this review, I want to give a little bit of an update on what's going to be happening in the future, or the near future, for this channel. Year-end list season is coming up, and obviously it's going to be quite different this year, being on YouTube and not on a blog. And I am going to make some changes, though, beyond that, and I wasn't planning on this at the start of the year, but I sort of realized there are a couple things that I wanted to change. So I haven't entirely figured out exactly how I'm going to be doing everything for year-end list season, but there are some notable changes I want to mention. First of all, I'm getting rid of, at least for this year, potentially for the future as well, I'm getting rid of the top 25 worst songs of the year. I just don't feel like taking all the time to listen to enough songs to fill out that list. And when you get onto that list, some of the songs that would end up there are because of like strong moral issues that I have with those tracks. And yeah, it doesn't really feel worth it for me to just go out of my way to listen to songs that are sending really hateful messages, or even if that's not what like, I mean, I already do that already. That's the thing. Like, I reviewed the Falling in Reverse album. I don't feel like taking all that time to go out of my way to listen to songs that are sending really hateful messages and that I have these big moral issues with. And even if I don't feel like listening to annoying songs that much, right? It's like, I think it's pretty understandable. I will be doing the top 10 worst hit songs of 2024. I'm also going to be doing the top 10 best hit songs of 2024. And I will be doing a top 10 worst albums. At least that's the plan for now. I'm sure I'll be able to find enough albums to put on that list. There are a couple albums I haven't really listened to much, which I think are very strong contenders for that list. But yeah, before I go on and on for too long, I just want to quickly say the other big change. I wasn't planning on this, but I have been thinking about it recently and have decided I think the best thing for me to do. I'm not going to be doing a top 100 songs of 2024. I'm going to be doing a top 50 instead. In the past, I've done 100, and I've just sort of realized, like, I hate to admit this, but looking back at it, even as recently as last year, I think some of that list was me trying too hard to fill out an entire top 100. And, like, I look back to that list now and realize, like, there's a lot of those tracks, even though I consider them my favorites of the year, I don't really remember all that well, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't accurate for how I was feeling at the time, but yeah, like looking back at it now, I'm just like, I think I was trying too hard to fill out a bigger list. And of course, I'll have more to say at the end of the year, but I just think it makes most sense to keep it to 50 this year. It'll be a lot less work as well. That's another big reason for that. So, as of right now, and this could change, but I think my plan is top 10 worst hit songs, top 10 best hit songs, top 10 worst albums, top 50 best albums. Still planning on the 50 albums. That's probably might be my favorite yearly tradition for this list. And top 50 best songs. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for watching this video. Feel free to let me know in the comment section if you have any ideas for my year-end lists. And also what you thought of this Hamish Hawk album if you've listened to it. Again, I think it's absolutely phenomenal. Like, yeah, I've praised it enough. I think I can end this video here. But thank you for watching. I will see you all soon.